everyone, welcome to my channel. It's very good to see you here again. I'm Leah from Koba.Siani. Today I'd like to show you a new pattern add-on for my dress Leah. And Leah is a sleeveless summer dress which usually looks like this here. And now the Leah dress gets sleeves. The Leah dress is, by the way, a pattern for lightweight woven fabrics, so everything you would use for a blouse or a men's shirt, for example. With the sleeves, of course, the Leah dress gets a little bit more winterly or for the transitional seasons, but especially with sleeve 3, you can also create amazing costumes. So at first, let me show you the 3 sleeve options. So at first there is sleeve 1, which is a narrow sleeve like this here. Then there is sleeve 2, which I'm wearing here, which has a gathered cuff with an elastic band inside. And there's a more opulent sleeve, sleeve 3, which is perfect for medieval costumes or other fantasy costumes. By the way, for my medieval inspired fantasy dress, this year I made a separate video for you where I show you more also the workmanship details, the embroidery, just as an inspiration for you. So with these 3 sleeve options you can really create the Leah dress which suits best to your occasion and to your personal style. Same as for the Leah dress, the sleeve add-on is available in sizes US 4 to 32. And of course, the add-on pattern is available in all my shops. The links you will find below in the description box. You can purchase the add-on as a single item when you've already purchased the Leah pattern before, or you can buy it as a pattern bundle with the dress pattern together. If you need some more sewing inspiration with the Leah sleeves, you should definitely check out the lookbook from the test sewers, who created really amazing test sewing samples. Before we start into the sewing video, please don't forget to like and to subscribe to my channel. This always helps me a lot as a small creator. But now enough talked, let's start into the sewing project. Have fun!
You probably have noticed that these 2 sewing samples don't have the original Leah length. So for these kinds of dresses, you don't have to add only the amount of fabric for the sleeves, but also some extra length for the skirt. So please don't forget that when you purchase your fabric. Altering the skirt length in the pattern is really very easy. Just lengthen it parallel to the original hemline. Here, please don't forget to adapt also the center front pattern piece, which goes all the way down to the hem. So this is also part of the skirt. More info about that, also about changing the sleeve length, you will find in the written sewing instruction. About my din A4 patterns, which also fit on US letter size paper, I've made a separate video for you, which is linked here. And again, in the written sewing instruction, you will find the exact pages which you have to print for your size. So like this, you can save paper and ink. At first, I'll show you now sleeves 1 and 2, which are very similar to make, but if you need the sewing video for sleeve 3, just hop to that chapter. Okay, so at first here, the fabric is cut, of course, and for both sleeves 1 and 2, you can just fold the fabric in half and then cut your sleeves, of course respecting the grain line, which is parallel to the selvage. Logically, you will receive like this a pair of sleeves, because even if they don't look like this, the Leah sleeves are not 100% symmetric. The shoulder notch lays a little bit in the front sleeve. Okay, so then after cutting your sleeves, please mark the shoulder notches and if you like to, also the hem notches. This can be done with a fabric marker, but depending on the fabric, I mean, if it doesn't fray too much, you can also mark the notches by cutting tiny little V's into the seam allowance. But be careful, these shouldn't be too deep. And here just a quick side note to the main dress, the skirt part. If you'd like to lengthen the skirt, it's not absolutely necessary you do this on the paper pattern already. You can also just cut the dress longer on the go, just like I'm doing it here. Before this next step now, you should sew up your Leah dress up and including chapter 8. Means the neckline is now ready, the shoulders are closed and the side seam is still open and the armholes untouched. Now the sleeves can be added to the armholes. Please make sure you match the correct sleeve into the correct armhole. The shorter distance between the shoulder notch and the sleeve seam on the sleeve is the front sleeve. So this goes into the front part. The back part and the back sleeve are wider. So the sleeves are at first pinned to the armholes, right fabric side to right fabric side, of course. That we can add now the sleeves with the sleeve seam and the side seam open is because of the construction of the sleeves, which have a really low sleeve head and are drafted out of a T form, which you encounter mostly with white t-shirts and men's shirts, and also here on the Leah dress with its dropped shoulders. Sleeves with higher sleeve heads, which are constructed differently, like for example for ladies' blouses and dresses and also blazers, are always sewn in a round, means the sleeve seam and the side seams are then already closed. Then the sleeves can be sewn in with a seam allowance of 1 centimeter as always. And here I'm always sewing with the sleeve layer on top. Then the seam allowance can be finished, which I'm doing here with my overlock sewing machine. But if you have none, you can also use the zigzag stitch of your household sewing machine. And then at last the seam allowance is pressed towards the sleeve. Here we are only working with the tip of the iron, so that the 3D shape of the garment is not destroyed. With some special pressing tools this can be easier, but it's also totally possible with a flat ironing board. Now the whole thing looks like a big cross. The next step is now more or less chapter 9 of the Leah dress sewing instructions, just that the sleeve seam is now included. Means here, when finishing the side seam edges, I also finish the sleeve seam edges. Then the pocket bags are added to the side seams, and then the side seams can be closed like described in the Leah instructions. Here, the sleeve seam is in one piece with the upper part of the side seam. At first, I'm pinning both fabric layers together, right side to right side, of course. Then the different sections of the side seams can be closed. Here, under the arm, we have to pay a little attention to the seam allowance. This I'm showing you here under the sewing machine. Here I start sewing the upper part of the side seam at the pocket bag with the regular seam allowance of 1 centimeter. Then I'm sewing upwards. As soon as I've reached the point just before the curve under the arm, I'm reducing the seam allowance a little bit to around 7 to 5 millimeter, and then I'm increasing it again to 1 centimeter. With this 1 centimeter, I continue just down to the cuff. This reduces the fabric pulling and puckering under the arm. Afterwards, a stop at the iron is a must. The side seam allowances are pressed apart, and with this, of course, also the sleeve seam allowance. Of course, a small sleeve ironing board is very practical there, but unfortunately, at the moment, mine is broken. But if you're careful, this is of course also possible without this tool. Afterwards, all other side seam details can be finished, such as the pockets and everything around them. Then it's time for the last step, the hem. For sleeves 1 and 2, the sleeve hems have the exact same hem allowance as the skirt hem, which is 2 + 1 centimeter. So this working step is happening together with the steps of chapter 11 of the Leah instruction. At first, the hem edge is pressed at first 1 centimeter, then 2 centimeter towards the wrong fabric side, then pinned in place, and afterwards it can be stitched. For sleeve 1, the sleeve hem is stitched all around, but for sleeve 2, you need to leave open a small gap of around 1 to 2 centimeter, so that you can insert the elastic band later. And this is what I'm doing here. I'm still using up here the soft elastic band which I bought back during Corona times for the face masks. And this is so soft and thin that I always only knot the ends together. But for some stiffer or wider elastic bands, of course, it's nicer to sew the ends together. Okay, that's it. If you've chosen sleeve 1 or 2, you're ready now. Here begins now the part of the video for sleeve 3. When you've decided to make sleeve 3, the most important question here is if you'd like to add a lining or not. On this blue-white patterned example, I'm making an unlined sleeve. So in this case, on both sleeve seam edges, 5 mm have to be added to the seam allowance. On the sketch, this is marked here in red. The pattern only includes a seam allowance of 1 centimeter, and here, without a lining, we need 1.5 centimeter. If you add a lining to the sleeve, you can just follow the paper pattern and cut along the paper edge. Also, my fabric here is not very representative. Normally, sleeve 3 doesn't fit next to each other on a fabric width. They only fit if you turn one sleeve for 180 degrees, either like this or in some bigger sizes like this. But this is only possible up to size 50 and for fabrics which don't have a direction. For all fabrics which have a direction, for example in their print or a nap, and also from size 52 upwards, the sleeves have to be cut like this, one below the other. And again here, please don't forget to cut the sleeves as a pair, as they aren't symmetrical. They may look like it, but they aren't. As notches for sleeve 3, only the shoulder notch is needed here. The sleeves are now folded with the right fabric side to the inside, so that the sleeve seam edges can be pinned together. With this step also, you have to take care that you produce a pair of sleeves, means the two sleeves are mirrored, so that they later will match to the armholes. The distance from the sleeve seam to the shoulder notch is slightly shorter in the front sleeve, and the longer distance between the notch and the fabric edge belongs to the back part. If you're making sleeves with lining, of course, you will have to do this working step on both the main fabric and the lining fabric. The sleeves with lining are then quickly made. The sleeve seam is at first closed with 1 centimeter seam allowance on both main fabric and lining fabric, and afterwards the seam allowances are pressed apart. For sleeves with lining, you can already hop now to the next chapter. For the sleeve without lining, a different workmanship is chosen, because here the inside of the sleeve seam is visible later, so the seam workmanship should be as clean as possible. This is why I'm suggesting a flat felt seam here. For this, at first, the sleeve seam is closed here with 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Now, one of the seam allowances is trimmed to its half, so that one side of the seam allowance is now 7 mm wide and the other remains 1.5 centimeter wide. If you'd like to make this 100% correct, again, you should take care that you make this as a pair, means mirrored on both sleeves. Afterwards, the seam allowances are pressed apart at first, and then pressed towards the shorter seam allowance, so that the wider seam allowance is now covering the shorter one. Then the longer seam allowance is folded and wrapped around the shorter seam allowance. It's pressed like this and pinned in place. You can already see how neat this looks. No overlock or zigzag finish, just clean fabric. At last, the sleeve seam is top stitched from the inside, just tightly along the folded edge. Of course, this workmanship takes a little bit longer, but I think it's totally worth it. By the way, did you notice that I put in the pins in the wrong direction? Here again we are aiming for a workmanship which is clean from the outside and the inside, as the inside is visible. But with these strong curves in the hemline, our possibilities are not endless. Okay, so at first the hemline is folded and pressed for around 7 to 8 mm towards the wrong fabric side. Then I fix this fold with a stitching right along the edge here. The distance from the folded edge to the stitching is around 1 to 2 mm. So really very close at the edge. Then the folded fabric is cut right besides the stitching. Again, of course, all around the hemline. Then you fold the hemline again over to the wrong fabric side like this, but again only a small amount, perhaps 2 to 3 mm. And then you stitch this fold in place from the right fabric side, and the stitching is again very near to the edge so that it can hold the fabric fold. With this technique, the hemline is folded twice to the wrong fabric side and it looks nice from both sides. But probably it's a bit wavy from the sewing process. So as a last step, please press your hemline, if your fabric allows it, with a lot of steam. This was the hem for a sleeve without lining. In this case, you can go to the next chapter. Now let's have a look at the sleeve with lining. Okay, so with this sleeve option, at first, if you're planning any embroidery along the sleeve hem where the backing should not be visible later, you should make the embroidery before continuing with the sleeve. As you can see here, my leaf embroidery is ready. Now the two sleeves are pinned together, right fabric side to right fabric side, along the hemline. And for this, I'm putting one sleeve into the other and then pinning the hem. Next, the two fabric layers are sewn together, as always with 1 cm seam allowance, and of course all around the hem. What's happening next is something we always do with these kinds of seams, and what you probably already know from the Leah neckline. The seam allowance has to be trimmed to its half, to 5 mm only, and then it needs to be clipped. The more rounded the seam is, the more often you should cut into the seam allowance. Please cut into it just before the seam, so that the seam, of course, is not destroyed, but the seam allowance can move better. By the way, if you notice later that your hemline curve is not smooth enough, you can always go back to this step here and improve your cuts. Either you need to cut deeper or more often. Then the two sleeves are again pulled apart for the next step, which is of course pressing. The seam allowance has to be pressed apart now, and if you don't have any special tools, it works quite well to use a wooden spoon here. Just take care that you don't burn your fingers. This step is quite time-consuming, but really worth it. As soon as this is done for the whole seam allowance, the lining sleeve can be now put into the main fabric sleeve, but this time wrong fabric side to wrong fabric side means just as it will be on the ready dress. Now the hem edge is pressed again, with the seam line slightly tilted to the lining sleeve. At this point you also really can check your hemline curve and if it's smooth enough. You can leave the sleeve like this or stitch down the seam allowance on the lining fabric for a neater edge. This stitching would go through the lining layer and the seam allowance layer, but not through the main fabric layer. Means you would have to pull apart the sleeves again. Or as a third possibility, you can add a stitching through all the fabric layers, which I'm doing on my sewing sample. I'm adding a tiny metallic cord along the sleeve hem with a zigzag stitch. This completes my embroidery and stabilizes the hem edge. As you can see it, at this point the dress is completely ready, only the armholes are waiting for the sleeves. And these sleeves I'm now pinning right side to right side into the armholes. And I'm saying it again, the sleeves are not symmetrical, so you have to match the right sleeve into the right armhole, otherwise the seam lengths are not matching. Of course, all three layers of fabric are now pinned together. And the sleeve seam is aligning with the side seam, as well as the shoulder seam with the shoulder notch on the sleeve. Then the sleeves are sewn in with 1 cm seam allowance, which afterwards is finished. And of course, if you're using an overlock sewing machine like me, you should thread in the overlock seam ends into the seam to secure the ends. At last, the seam allowance is pressed towards the body. Now normally the sleeve 3 is also ready. Here only follows an optional chapter, and that's adding a button-up function. This could be very useful depending on which activities you plan in the dress. At first, you fold the bottom of your sleeve hem upwards along the sleeve seam so that the rest of the sleeve is still straight. And at this point, where the hem meets the sleeve seam, you sew on a button by hand on the sleeve seam under the arm. At the hem at the sleeve seam, we'll add now a small loop, which can be attached to the button. And to make this loop, we use a regular sewing thread in 4 plies thick, threaded into a normal hand sewing needle. This needle is now guided from the side between the two fabric layers to the point where the loop should begin. Here I'm making some small knots to secure the thread. Then I pierce through the fabric where the loop should end. This is at an approximate distance from the first point of around 1.5 centimeter. Now we make the loop a little bit thicker by guiding the thread back to the first point of the loop. And to make this evenly, you can use, for example, a pencil, but only the tip, otherwise the loop would be too big. This forth and back of the thread you can repeat 3 times in total. Then the loop is checked. if it fits over the button, and if it's okay, you can lock now the thread again with a knot. This knot goes also through the fabric. I say this because the wrapping of the loop, which is done next, consists also of knots, but these knots are only placed along the loop and don't go through the fabric. Now knot after knot is done until the whole loop is covered. This sounds exhausting, but is surprisingly quickly done. Then, when the whole loop is covered and the other side of the loop is reached with the knots, one last knot is made through the fabric again to secure everything. Then the needle is guided again through the fabric layers to the side and the thread can then be cut. And now the loop is ready to be used.
Okay, that's it already. Your Leah dress with sleeves is hopefully ready also now. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and to subscribe here. And I hope to see you very soon again to my next sewing video. Take care until then. Bye!